Welcome to Breaking News to Trading Moves.
Today we're looking at a court procedural ruling. And, on the surface it might sound like just bureaucratic fine print.
It does, but it prompted some real movement in the energy sector. It affected everything from oil producers to rail freight and even the outlook for some solar companies.
Yeah, so our goal here is to really analyze what this ruling meant for different parts of the market. We're going to identify which companies saw a near-term benefit and which ones faced some pressure, all based on the reporting we've compiled.
Okay, so the core event we're tracking, it involves the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Right. Specifically, a ruling about the Sable Offshore pipeline system in Santa Barbara County, California.
In Sable Offshore, that's ticker SOC, saw a noticeable jump in its stock price right after the court denied an emergency request from several environmental groups.
And that request was really a last-ditch effort to pause the federal approval for the pipeline to restart.
So when the court said no to that pause,
it removed a very immediate, very high-stakes roadblock for Sable Offshore. It opened up a crucial path forward for them.
So before we get into the actual market moves, let's give this some context. This pipeline, it hasn't been operational for years. Can you just walk us through why it was shut down in the first place?
Sure. The pipeline's been dormant since 2015.
2015, okay.
Yeah, following the Refugio oil spill. That event basically just froze all operations tied to the Santa Ynez Unit. So for almost a decade, production assets linked to that big offshore operation have been, choked off.
And getting that crude ashore through the pipeline is the only way to make it all work financially.
It's absolutely critical. It's the key to making the entire Santa Ynez operation economically viable again.
So we're not just talking about the pipeline, we're talking about unlocking all the oil behind it, which I think brings us to that phrase analysts use, the regulatory overhang.
That term is a perfect fit here. The regulatory overhang is just that cloud of legal and, permitting uncertainty that pushes down the value of an asset.
Even if the oil is still right there in the ground.
Exactly. For a company like Sable Offshore, their entire production capacity was essentially held hostage because the transportation was unavailable, tied up in legal fights. So when the court denied that emergency injunction, it peeled back a layer of that uncertainty.
It suggested that, at least for now, the legal path is a little bit clearer.
A little bit clearer, yes. But we should be very clear, this is not the final word.
Right. We're still expecting a lot more legal and regulatory moves here.
Absolutely. The legal fight is far from over. The immediate reaction we saw in the market was simply pricing in the removal of one specific threat, that emergency pause.
So future volatility is pretty much baked into this story.
No question. Any subsequent challenge or a new requirement from, say, a state agency could halt or delay progress all over again. This is just a story of regulatory risk being temporarily lowered, not eliminated.
Okay, let's turn to the immediate beneficiaries then. When that risk drops, certain assets get re-rated pretty quickly. Our first theme here is focused on companies tied directly to this California restart.
This group benefits because the economic timeline for bringing those barrels back online just got shorter and more certain.
And that's where you see the value being unlocked.
That's where you see the biggest re-rating, yeah.
Yeah.
The value is trapped by legal delays, and now it's suddenly released.
Sable Offshore Corp, SOC, is obviously the main one here.
The most direct winner, yes.
But we also saw positive movement in some global energy majors, Occidental Petroleum, OXY, and Chevron, CVX. Now, why would these massive global companies care about one local California pipeline?
Well, that's a great point. While OXY and CVX are global, the Santa Ynez Unit represents a very large known quantity of proven reserves for them.
Okay.
For OXY, for example, their exposure to the potential throughput, the number of barrels that could eventually flow, it's material to their regional operation.
So when the transport infrastructure needed to monetize, that asset gets clearer.
Even the stock prices of the majors will reflect that. It's an improvement in potential cash flow. It's an efficiency gain for barrels they already own.
So the ruling makes previously complicated barrels accessible again, which I guess leads us to our second group of beneficiaries, California refining and downstream leverage. How does the pipeline restart affect refiners?
This is all about supply logistics. When this pipeline restarts, it introduces a reliable flow of locally sourced crude back into the California market.
And that local supply means they don't have to rely as much on imported crude.
Which is often higher cost, yes. It has to be shipped in. This affects what are called crude differentials, the price difference between various grades of crude.
So more local supply can bring down those price differences.
It can. And refiners with big operations in the state, like PBF Energy, that's PDBF, Valero Energy, VLO, and Phillips 66, PUSX, they all benefit from improved feedstock flexibility.
If they can source cheaper local crude instead of expensive imports, their profit margins go up.
It can be a direct expansion of their profit margins. It's a structural cost reduction for every barrel they process.
Makes sense. Now, what about the third group of winners? Oil field services and infrastructure work. This one's a bit different, right? It happens whether the oil is flowing yet or not.
That's precisely it. You can't just flip a switch on a major piece of infrastructure that's been shut down for nearly a decade.
Right. There's a ton of prep work.
A massive amount. Maintenance, inspection, compliance ramp-up. The court ruling basically signals go ahead for all that preparatory work. So that means immediate spending on services.
So we're talking about things like complex inspections, replacing parts, setting up monitoring systems.
All of that. And that creates a short-term spending boost for the specialized firms. We look at the major global service providers with the technology for these kinds of jobs.
So companies like SLB.
SLB, yes. Halliburton, HAL, and Baker Hughes, BKR. For them, a big infrastructure restart like this, especially one needing extensive safety and environmental checks, translates into immediate demand for their high-margin services.
Okay, so now that we've covered the beneficiaries, let's pivot to the flip side. The companies that face some pressure after the ruling.
Yeah, and we have to start with the logistics providers, the ones who were, filling the gap while the pipeline was down.
Their business model was basically benefiting from the constraint.
Exactly. When pipeline transport becomes viable again, it directly reduces the need for moving those barrels by other, less efficient methods. And this specifically hits crude, tanker, and marine transport companies.
Because the crude had to travel by boat up and down the coast, which created this sort of artificial demand for those routes.
Precisely. And when that artificial demand goes away, it puts pressure on the utilization rates and the pricing power of those tankers.
So who are we talking about here?
The companies that saw this pressure included International Seaways, that's INSW, TK Tankers, TNK, and Scorpio Tankers, STNG. It's not a disaster for them, but the market sees that a source of local transport demand has been reduced.
A similar logic seems to apply to our second group here, rail freight with energy commodity exposure.
It's very similar. The mechanism here is what we call option value in rail transport.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, pipelines are always the preferred method for crude. They're high volume, lowest cost. But when a pipeline is closed or constrained, producers rely on rail as a flexible alternative.
And the rail companies can charge a premium for that flexibility.
They can. It's the option to use the railroad when pipelines fail or capacity is tight.
Yeah.
When the pipeline constraints are eased, that option value diminishes.
So it puts new competition on moving those barrels.
It does. It eases the constraint and puts some marginal pressure on the energy commodity transport revenue for the big rail operators. We saw this effect on companies like Union Pacific, UNP, and Norfolk Southern, and SCC.
And our third and final group that face pressure is less about physical logistics and more about market perception, renewables, and the solar sector.
This is a classic example of sentiment affecting stocks outside the immediate area. A ruling that supports restarting fossil fuel infrastructure is often interpreted by the market as a marginally less supportive environment for clean energy.
It just dampens the enthusiasm for the transition stocks a little bit.
Just a little. But that perception creates short-term pressure on the pure-play renewable companies. The ones that saw some of this downward movement included Enphase Energy, ENPH, First Solar, FSLR, and SolarEdge Technologies, SEDG.
It just shows how a localized decision about one pipeline can influence sentiment across the entire energy landscape.
It does.
Okay, so this gives us a good picture of the immediate reaction, but as we said, the story is not over. What specific things should we be watching for in the next few weeks and months?
We need to watch three interconnected areas. First, and most obviously, is the ongoing formal legal process.
Which means looking at procedural details, briefing deadlines, hearing schedules.
And the specific next steps the environmental groups choose to take. Any subsequent decision, or even a procedural delay, will generate headlines and more volatility for Sable Offshore and its partners.
The market is watching that legal timeline very closely.
Very closely. Second is the regulatory landscape. And this is where it can get really complex because you have state versus federal jurisdiction.
So we need to watch the California state regulators.
Especially concerning fire safety oversight. Even if the federal courts seem to have cleared a path, State agencies have their own mandates. They could assert those mandates and create new parallel roadblocks.
A federal green light could get slowed down by state requirements on fire suppression or inspections.
That's a very common source of friction. And finally, we have to watch the actual operational progress. We need to look for tangible signs that the restart is becoming a reality.
Not just a legal possibility, what kind of milestones are we talking about?
We need to watch for official statements on startup milestones, any updated guidance on expected pipeline throughput, how many barrels per day they anticipate moving, and crucially, any safety headlines related to the initial operations.
After a decade of downtime, the safety performance during that ramp-up is a primary risk factor.
It's the primary operational risk.
So to quickly recap, a single court decision re-rated assets tied to regulatory permissions. This created winners tied to production, like SOC and OXY, and also refiners who get cheaper access to local supply, like PBF.
And on the other side, it put pressure on the logistics providers, the marine shippers and rail carriers, who were benefiting from the pipeline being shut down. And it also created some short-term negative sentiment for renewable stocks like E and PH. It really shows how interconnected the whole energy supply chain is.
For a final thought, let's consider that jurisdictional battle you mentioned. The conflict between California's desire for state-level fire safety oversight and the claims of federal jurisdiction over the pipeline. That seems like the next major flashpoint.
It certainly does.
So if the state uses safety regulations to enforce stricter compliance or introduce delays that conflict with federal timelines, how will that introduce the next round of complexity, and which stocks will be the first to react? That's something for you to keep an eye on. That procedural uncertainty is definitely the next stage in this story.
We want to remind you that this discussion is based purely on the information provided to us. We are not offering financial advice or a recommendation to buy or sell any of the stocks mentioned.
This discussion purely conveys the information and opinions contained within the provided material.